Hi, everyone. This is Aaron Larson, Executive Editor of Power Magazine, and you are listening to the Power Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by the Electric Power Supply Association President and CEO, Todd Snitchler. So, Todd, thank you for joining me. Tell a little bit about the EPSA and what you guys do.
Sure, and thanks, Aaron, for having me. It's a pleasure to have a chance to chat with you. So, the Electric Power Supply Association is the only national trade association that represents independent power producers or competitive power generators. And our business is a little different than some of our utility and public power and co-op cousins in that our members don't have any captive customers. Instead, our members generate electricity and sell it into the wholesale markets or to customers who have specific needs through some contractual relationship. But we have no captive ratepayers that are obligated to pay for our investments or to ensure our rate of return. Instead, our members are incentivized to be as efficient, low cost, and today lower emitting resources than they have been in the past, because that's what the market is asking for. And so our members compete amongst themselves and against each other in order to be the entities that deliver electrons into the system that ultimately delivers a reliable, affordable, lower emitting energy system today.
Electricity markets are kind of different in different regions. Yeah. Can you kind of set the stage by explaining how the different markets function across the U.S.?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And I'll take one step back and explain a little bit how we fit in with our cousins and how we're different. So the traditional vertically integrated utilities, so the companies that you would recognize, the Southern companies or Duke or some of the other large vertically integrated utilities, they do everything from the power generation station across transmission lines down to the distribution system, right up to your light switch. So they're full system from start to finish. And they have guaranteed cost recovery from their state regulators that oversee their rate cases. And so that's how they're compensated. Public power is substantially similar in that they own a lot of generation, but they also have the wires business and move the electrons from where they're generated to their customers. But their structure is different in that they are typically authorized by local municipalities. So the local elected officials are the ones who set their rates. And then the rural co-ops are the fourth leg of the stool, and they operate a little more like a traditional vertically integrated utility in that they often own the generation, the transmission, and the distribution wires, but they are oftentimes the last mile. So there are a lot of the rural parts of the country that are not served by other types of entities, and so they're the supplier that is ultimately responsible for delivering electrons to their customers. So the parts of the country, as you mentioned, that operate differently, there are parts that are restructured, and that is typically the Northeast, New York, the Mid-Atlantic states, or PJM, which I'm sure we'll talk about, Texas, California, and then parts of the upper Midwest and MISO have a flavor of restructuring as part of how they operate. And then there's traditional vertically integrated parts of the country like the Southeast and much of the Northwest, where it is a balancing authority or the entity that makes sure that the electrons flow from where they're generated to where they're needed is managed by the utility or utility affiliate. And so that's all done internally, so to speak, as opposed to the restructured markets where you have a grid operator or an RTO, a regional transmission organization, or an ISO, an independent system operator, who essentially takes control of the transmission system and then moves the power where it needs to be in the most efficient way that it can. It sets the price signals in order to determine who is paid for the commodity as it is being put onto the system, and ultimately manages and balances the system to ensure that the system remains reliable, that it remains functional, and that customers are able to receive the power that they would otherwise receive, but in a way that is safe and ensures that there are no interruptions on the system. So there are some pretty significant differences, but in the end, all of the systems around the country are aspiring to deliver as high a rate of reliability of electric service to their customers as possible.
Yeah, that's a great explanation, and it's really interesting to me that there are so many different ways that the system is operated, even amongst the ISOs and RTOs that you spoke about. They do different things, different ways, and it's quite a dance that goes on just to make the market work. So what makes competitive markets or competitive wholesale markets the best option in your view?
Our members have every incentive to be the least cost, most reliable option that's available. Because if you are that resource, you're going to be the resource that's selected to run. And so that is your incentive to perform at a very high level. I think the second and oftentimes overlooked real value proposition for our members is that investment decisions that are made by independent power producers or competitive power generators are risks that are borne on the backs of the shareholders and investors only, and not any captive customer. Because as I noted at the beginning of our discussion, we simply don't have captive customers that we can recover over a period of years for our investments. We have to listen to what the market is saying it needs and then fill that need as is appropriate for the right investments. But in the event that we make a bad investment decision or we make a decision that was perhaps poorly timed, the only people that pay the price for that are the investors and shareholders. So the risk is moved completely off of customers who don't really have an option because of where they're located. And it's put back on the people we think are best able to wear that risk, and that's the investors and shareholders. And that is the single largest difference between us and each of the other types of entities that I have described, is that that risk is borne by our members and not by captive customers. And that really drives your incentive to perform well and to perform at least cost.
Yeah, it definitely sets you up to really manage your costs in an efficient way, I would say. So
that's right.
Most of the people in our audience know that we're seeing a large transition from, traditional fossil fuels to more renewable energy. As that is taking place, what challenges do you see being presented not only to grid operators but to the power companies that are operating in these markets?
Yeah, that's the $64,000 question today, Aaron. We've got a lot of warning lights that appear to be flashing today. And I say that not just from our perspective, but from NERC, the reliability coordinator, or from FERC, who has also expressed concerns, and all of the grid operators around the country have raised concerns about the pace of the energy transition, which we frankly don't prefer that term. I call it energy expansion because we see load growth that is not on the horizon. It's here today. So we're going to need more resources and not less. And we can talk about that in a minute. But I think the challenge we're seeing is that there are a number of resources that are either having regulatory burdens that are placed on them that make them less competitive in comparison to resources that are not facing the same challenges. Or there are resources that are highly subsidized, and as a result of those subsidies, it creates an economic disadvantage to unsubsidized resources, and that puts economic pressure on units that would otherwise be able to run and would earn a sufficient amount of revenue to remain on the system. And we're also seeing a pretty significant acceleration in retirements off of the system of dispatchable resources. And what does that mean? So, of course, it means the coal plants that have been on the system for decades as a result of economics and environmental policies are retiring and moving off of the system. You're seeing some of the older gas units experience the same kind of financial and regulatory pressures, and that is forcing some of them off of the system. And we're seeing a large penetration of new renewable resources come onto the system that, frankly, are good energy resources, but don't have the same performance characteristics that the dispatchable resources have. And so we're having to fill a gap, or as I call it, the delta between aspirational policy goals and operational realities of the system. Because too much retirement of dispatchable resources without sufficient resources that can replicate or deliver the same types of services that those dispatchable resources can provide creates reliability concerns. And that's where you're seeing concerns expressed by NERC, the grid operators, and even the FERC Commission as they look at how the energy expansion, as we prefer to call it, is actually happening or working itself out on the ground.
I guess I'm going to try to replicate your wording. I think you called it
Sure.
An energy expansion. And
correct.
What that is coming from, I think, is the electrification of practically everything out there. I mean, we're seeing electric cars come on the road. We're seeing, things that may have previously been powered by natural gas are getting electrified, and
Yep.
so you're getting more electric heating, for example. How does all of that factor into the work that you're doing and what should be done in the power system in general?
Yeah, I think you've identified many of the main drivers of load growth. The other one that everyone reads about, it seems daily now, is data centers or artificial intelligence is also driving up energy demand in pockets around the country, but really in most of the country, there are areas where you're seeing that. But it's also reshoring of manufacturing. It's as a result of policies coming from states or from the federal government to encourage the deployment of resources and companies coming back to the states and building facilities here. So we're seeing pretty significant load growth for the first time in probably 20 or more years. And so that is creating a lot of pressure on the system to make sure that we have sufficient megawatts, which we do presently. So I think it's important for us to keep the perspective that this is an evolving problem, but we have the resources needed today. But we're going to see resources come off the system, as we were just talking about a moment ago. And we're struggling with getting resources onto the system at a fast enough pace to replace the ones that are retiring and in order to meet this new energy demand. And we think that it's important to be focused on competitive solutions and competitive power supply because, as we were discussing a moment ago, that's the way that you shift risk off of consumers, meaning they don't have to pay those costs. And it's clear that there is going to be a significant amount of new generation build that will have to be done. None of it is inexpensive. Everything will have a cost associated with it in the billions and billions of dollars. And that doesn't contemplate the transmission infrastructure that will need to be built, which also has a significant multi-billion-dollar price tag. And the distribution system will also have to be upgraded in order to accommodate the electrification that you noted a moment ago. So we think the best approach to mitigate cost for consumers and still deliver reliable energy is to utilize markets and competitive generation because it keeps the risk off consumers. It incentivizes good performance and smart investment decisions in order to ensure system reliability. And looking at the broader cost and how consumers respond to that, if we want to do many of these policies and to complete them successfully, cost is a significant barrier that can't be underestimated. So if there's a way for us to help to mitigate those costs and keep costs at a reasonable level for consumers across the board, we think that's the best way to help effectuate the policies that policymakers want to make while still delivering on reliability, which really is job one. Without that, you'll lose public support no matter what the cost is.
You talked a little bit about policies, and without getting too deeply into the politics behind them, what kind of policies are helpful when members look at what is being asked of them and the system?
This is probably the biggest conundrum we face in Washington today, which is there's a clear need for permitting and siting reform. And I say that because you're going to need to be able to accelerate deployment of all types of resources, whether it's renewable resources and the transmission infrastructure that is needed to move the electrons from where they're generated to where they're going to be needed, as well as on the other side of the equation, there's a need for more pipeline infrastructure to address gas-electric coordination issues, as well as the fact that even in a highly renewable penetration scenario, there is still going to be a substantial need for natural gas-fired or other dispatchable generation that can respond quickly and fill the gaps when we don't have the access to the energy provided by wind and solar because perhaps the wind isn't blowing or the sun's not shining, or you have a peak demand event and you really need every electron you can get. You're going to need those dispatchable resources in order to ensure system reliability. So the system will likely operate differently than it does today, but it's not just wires, it's not just pipes, and it's not just, approval of certain projects. It's all of the above approach that's going to contemplate what needs to be done in order to advance the policy objectives set forward under the IRA and some of the state policies that we're dealing with, but also an acknowledgement of reality about what it will take in order for us to keep the system reliable and affordable. And that's going to mean the retention of and addition of new dispatchable resources, primarily gas because of its performance characteristics, in order to ensure that that can happen in a way that is reliable. And so we need policymakers to come to the table, put their knees under the table, and strike a deal that makes sense for all of the parties so that you can get the win for the one side that says they want wires and renewables, and you can still have a win for the folks that need the pipes and the siting support for dispatchable resources. And politically, that seems like that makes a lot of sense, but it's the actual passage and implementation of that policy that is a challenge. And our members just look for a reasonable degree of regulatory certainty. The pendulum going too far one direction or the other every 2 or 4 years makes it very difficult to make 30-year investment decisions. And so some stability around policy that really narrows that pendulum swing and ensures that resources can be constructed is really what will help solve a lot of these issues.
And when you talk about rules and regulations, the one organization that typically comes up is the Environmental Protection Agency.
Indeed, they do.
And just on April 25th, they finalized 4 major environmental rules covering such things as greenhouse gases, air toxics, wastewater discharges, and coal combustion residuals from fossil plants. What, if anything, did the EPSA do to try to steer the EPA in the right direction on these rules, and how do you see them impacting power generators going forward?
Yeah, we engaged early and often with our federal regulators at EPA in an effort to make sure that they understood the potential implications of the rule. And you may recall that there was a significant part of the rule that was dropped for existing resources, and I think they're going to come back to that in 2025. But we tried to convey a couple of things that we think are vitally important. One, the need for resources is real, and it is upon us now. So forcing resources off the system before there are sufficient amounts of replacement is slow walking ourselves into a reliability problem that's avoidable. We encourage them not to make that mistake. We also commented pretty significantly around the viability of carbon capture and sequestration and hydrogen as alternatives for, the best available technology in order to comply with the rule. We let them know that we didn't think that that was quite ready for prime time. We have members who are actively participating in DOE programs in order to try and solve the carbon capture question. We have members that have been invested in the only carbon capture project in the United States that was functional, Petronova. So our members are not opposed to carbon capture, but the ability to deploy it on large scale on a new technology. It's not been deployed to natural gas units before. It's been attempted on coal facilities before, I think is a real cause for concern. And we brought that to their attention along with hydrogen co-firing, because the access to hydrogen, the transportation of hydrogen, and the volumes that would be required, we thought were potentially problematic. And that was ultimately dropped from the rule. But we still see carbon capture as part of the compliance mechanism. Although they did adjust timelines, we still think that there are real compliance issues that are going to be of concern. And I say that because, as we noted, we think that that's going to result in early retirement of units that are needed to ensure reliability. It's going to raise costs and reduce your ability to operate plants at the highest capacity factor possible. It has the potential to have the perverse outcome of having units that are higher emitting and lower efficient run more than lower emitting, higher efficient units. And so that was really one of the fundamental things we tried to make sure that EPA understood, that the rule as crafted didn't get exactly where we thought they were trying to get to. Some of those comments seem to have been received and incorporated, but many of them were not. And so now we are certain that litigation will follow as a result of the publication of the rule. It's been telegraphed by any number of state organizations and others that they intend to litigate. And so we will see how quickly some of these things are actually implemented. Are they stayed? What will the next steps be as a result of litigation? And that will certainly bear watching and will really drive our engagement, depending on what comes of that litigation.
Sure. And that seems to be the typical flow path. Whenever the EPA issues something, it's going to get litigated and it's going to get worked out somehow in court and via other methods. So more to come on that.
Exactly.
As far as emissions go, is there anything that you think can be done to help reduce emissions while still maintaining and even improving system reliability in some way?
Well, I think we can show there's been significant progress made on the emissions question. If you look at U.S. emissions, they're the only country in the world where our emissions are down over the last 20 years. And PJM just issued a report about a week ago where it talked about the amount of reduction in emissions it had, and it was led by two of the largest states in the PJM footprint, Ohio and Pennsylvania. And that's been due to a couple things, not least of which is the Marcellus and Utica gas that has made natural gas an incredibly low-cost commodity, able to provide feedstock for power generators in the region, and that led to the retirement of coal units or higher-emitting older units. And so investment happened, and that has driven down emissions. And we think that is certainly fundamental to how we get there from here, and we think that should continue. But in the end, if the objective is to reduce emissions, and carbon emissions in particular, then an economy-wide price on carbon would be an approach that would make sense in order to try and achieve that objective. Now, we have been for a price on carbon for some time. Politically, it is probably out of favor. The passage of the IRA has kind of changed the political dynamic, although there was a number of folks way back in the late 2000 and the aughts that were interested in trying to pass the carbon tax, and they, of course, were voted out of office. So I think people are a little more gun-shy about pursuing that again. But in the end, if your objective is to reduce emissions, then you need to think about what's the most efficient way for us to do that. And it's our belief that an economy-wide price on carbon would be the most efficient way for us to do that. So we hold out hope that that may be a way for us to tackle this issue, but I think politically at the moment it's more than a bit tenuous, and so we will see how things play out over the next 5 years or so to see if there are people who come around to having that conversation again.
Yeah, it seems like a very difficult conversation that nobody wants to get involved in, so hopefully you can
That's right.
help spur that along. Talking about the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, you mentioned them earlier. Is there anything that they're working on right now that you are watching closely and hope to influence?
Yeah, we are not a transmission organization. We're a generator organization, but the transmission rule that they are going to roll out, I think, is perhaps one of the largest issues that is before FERC right now and has been for some time. We've all been watching for the better part of a year for this to come out. And so it has the potential to impact our members. So we have been really in a monitoring mode, but we will be paying attention to that because it is vitally important that it get it right if we want to try and have success occur. So we will see what comes from that. And I know the chairman is very focused on trying to get to a spot that makes the most sense, that is legally durable, and will actually achieve the objectives that have been set forth. So we're optimistic that Chairman Phillips will try to land in the right spot, but we'll have to see what the actual rule says. And then we've been working on and continue to work on a number of market-related issues. We've unfortunately had to litigate a number of cases that were decided by FERC. We've been successful in some and not successful in others. But I think many parties are trying to address what are the appropriate market reforms that will be needed in order to ensure that resources that ensure reliability, can respond quickly, are dispatchable, and provide services to the system that will remain needed for decades to come, can be properly compensated in order to keep them on the system. Because as I noted a moment ago, they're probably going to operate significantly differently. You're not going to see gas plants run 24/7, 365. But when they are required to run, say in a cold snap or in a hot weather event, they're going to be needed, and they will be the difference between the system staying on and being reliable and the system having a reliability problem or a load shed event, which no one wants. And so we're having to work through how do we figure out the appropriate way to compensate them? How do we make sure that there are sufficient revenues in order for them to invest in the facilities and earn a reasonable rate of return, while at the same time making sure that they are an active participant and part of the marketplace. So we are continually working on trying to find solutions and offer suggestions about how we think about that in order to ensure the reliability of the system and the viability of our business model. Because as I noted at the very outset, we think that we bring the most efficient, least cost approach that keeps risk off of consumers. And that's a model that really needs to be replicated and not abandoned or jettisoned because of convenience or complication. Our industry does things very much out in the open, and people say that it's messy, but those are things that you can be engaged in and that people can see how things are working out, as opposed to not seeing what happens and then you have a surprise when a case is resolved and your rates go up. You actually will see that process through how the competitive or the restructured regions function. And so I think that's a feature, not a bug. And it may be cumbersome and it may be difficult, but it gets to the right outcomes. And we think that's another value that we bring to the system.
And there's been a lot of discussion of late, not only at FERC and NERC, but even by grid operators about gas and electric coordination issues and how critical they are to the electric reliability. What does it look like from your perspective as a key stakeholder, and how would your group engage to help shape those reforms and work through delivering a more reliable system?
Yeah, I think this is the other significant issue that remains a bit of overhang. And we have been actively involved really since Winter Storm Elliott, when we reached out to our colleagues on the interstate pipeline system and the gas supply side and said, we want to try and be productive. And it doesn't do us any good to point fingers at other sectors. And instead, how can we collaborate and try to find a pathway forward that will help ensure reliability? And we'll do so in a way where reforms can be supported by industry. Hopefully, they're supported by our regulators and will lead to an outcome that is higher reliability for customers and less risk to the system. And so we worked with NGSA, the Natural Gas Supply Association, and INGA, the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America. I always have to make sure I get Amy's association correct. And we sat down and spent months working together on what some solutions could be in order for us to talk with people about how suppliers and the pipelines and the customers that are independent power producers would think about what changes need to be made in order for us to be more efficient and to operate more reliably. And we found a couple of things, not least of which is there is no one silver bullet. So all of these are challenging, difficult issues. And so I like to say there may not even be silver buckshot. But what there are a number of smaller decisions that can be made that incrementally will continue to improve outcomes and help the system. And so we published a white paper. We called it the Reliability Alliance White Paper that included a number of our recommendations and things that we thought policymakers needed to be aware of and potential solutions in order to try and address this issue. As a result of that, we were able to share it with a number of the FERC commissioners. We were invited to speak to our friends at NERC who were interested in what was happening. We were invited to participate at a NERC board meeting to share, the three of us, what we had been working on and how we thought that might fit together and be helpful as they look at reliability concerns, because NERC has been very focused on gas electric reliability and coordination. And we've also been invited to share our findings with the GEAR that was put together by NERC under President Fedorchik's leadership in an effort to address this gas-electric harmonization issue. And so we've presented to them, and I know that each of our industries, among others, are represented on the GEAR task force, as well as the state regulators that are there in an effort to try and put the most practical, realistic solutions on the table and then make meaningful recommendations that can be implemented, as opposed to a report that ultimately gets put on a shelf and doesn't actually solve the problem. So we've tried to be very engaged and very deliberate in how we want to tackle this, because we recognize the importance of natural gas. We recognize its increasing importance to the reliability of the electric system, and we want to be part of the discussion about finding solutions and not merely complaining about making sure that the system can work. So that's how we've been engaged. We envision that conversation continuing and broadening to include more of the upstream producers as well as the LDCs through the American Gas Association and through some of the larger producer organizations, to make sure that the entire value chain is represented as we have conversations about how to best align two industries that grew up in very different worlds but are now being knit together closer than they've ever been.
Definitely some good discussions that you're having that hopefully will result in some good outcomes. So
that is certainly the objective.
Yeah. Well, Todd, this has been really insightful. I appreciate you taking the time. Is there any last words or anything that we haven't talked about that you think would be important to mention?
No, Aaron, I think this has been a great conversation. You've really covered the waterfront, and I think that, we see more issues on the horizon and not less. But I know that our members and our staff are committed to try and arrive at solutions on these things. So we'll continue to remain engaged. But in the end, we want to make sure that, I always say people want three things. They want lights on, beer cold, water warm. And our members aim to make sure that we do everything we can to deliver that to consumers at least cost.
Again, for listeners, I've been speaking with the Electric Power Supply Association's President and CEO, Todd Snitchler. Thanks again for your time, Todd. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I wish you well getting through some of these issues with FERC and other agencies that you're dealing with.
Thanks, Aaron. Really appreciate the time.